Spider-Man Noir, Twilight in Babylon was written by Margaret Stohl and illustrated by Juan E. Ferreira. The original character of Spider-Man Noir was originally conceived by Dan Slott and was intended to be a much darker interpretation of the web crawler, with Peter Parker being reimagined as a gritty detective in 1950s New York. Most audiences gravitated to this new version of Spider-Man as it was a much darker and realistic interpretation that severely contrasted the more optimistic and hopeful version of the character. This grittiness was seen by the fact that this version of Peter Parker actually carried dual handguns, and that this iteration of Uncle Ben was not in fact simply shot in an alleyway, but was eaten alive by a cannibal. This new twist on the character was shocking, adult, but more importantly, it was unique and allowed for more varied storytelling within the Spider-Man universe. However, many fans believe that Margaret Stohl's Spider-Man Noir, Twilight in Babylon failed to live up to the expectations that surrounded the new character. Critics' reviews weren't particularly great, but audience reactions were not particularly abhorrent. This essay will attempt to explain why audience had such a flat reaction to what was otherwise a very popular and promising character. First off, we must discuss the specific meaning of noir and its influences over modern media. Noir was a movie genre founded during the mid-1900s, focusing upon a post-World War I era, where gangs roamed the street. The Great Depression was in full effect, and due to the loss of public trust in government and societal ideals, people were much more open to the idea of moral ambiguity. Upon first glance, one may ask why a character like Spider-Man might be reimagined in such a depressing and grim environment. However, upon further inspection, the opportunity and creative freedom that could be achieved by introducing Spider-Man in such an environment are practically endless. There are many comics and even movies that focus upon Peter's money troubles and struggles to stay afloat financially. This key aspect of the character can be smoothly adapted into the story, and can even be used to properly represent and comment on what life was actually like during the Great Depression, and if done right can help differentiate this version of the character from the main one while still remaining faithful to it. Not only that, but the idea of putting such an idealistic character in such a cynical and unforgiving environment would provide ample conflict for this version of Peter Parker. Perhaps this version of the character would have to sacrifice his idealistic values that were passed down by his Uncle Ben, because he begins to believe that such values are outdated in such a cutthroat and cynical world, adding an element of tragedy to the character that would further differentiate him from the main version. Not to mention, Spider-Man Noir can pay clever tribute to the original Noir films, and by extension introduce new audiences to this unique style of storytelling that's not really replicated in other forms of media. This was somewhat achieved by his earlier stories written by David Heen and Fabrice Sapolsky, but ceases to be taken advantage of in Stohl's run of the character. This isn't to say that her run failed because she didn't appeal to the fans' original expectations of the character, for many artists have still made well-received and excellent stories while still subverting audience expectation. However, even when judged on its own merit, Stohl's run still doesn't carve itself out as being a standout story, nor a good rendition on the Spider-Man mythos. Strangely enough, she seems to make the odd choice to pay homage to the original Indiana Jones films, rather than any specific noir movies. Which, if one were to fully consider why this character was created in the first place, would be viewed as an extremely peculiar choice. Indiana Jones is essentially a much more lighthearted and campy movie genre that uses to be a well-crafted adventure film rather than a cynical, stylized narrative set in 1950s New York. An issue becomes apparent when Stohl isn't realizing the dramatic potential that a character like this could, and for all intents and purposes, should have. Not to say the story has tropes that are reminiscent of noir tales, but not only did audiences see this as an odd detraction from the character's previous stories, but also as a serious missed opportunity. Furthermore, it doesn't help that the Indiana Jones tropes themselves are only utilized for the sake of homage and nothing more. For example, if you look at the plot summary for the comic, after months of searching, the Nazis have discovered an ancient evil in a dig site on the other side of the world, and scrappy young reporter Peter Parker soon finds himself torn from his friendly neighborhood and forced into international action. We can already infer that this will be extremely reminiscent of Indiana Jones tropes, such as the presentation of Nazis as the main antagonists, and the archaeological plot point with the inclusion of the ancient dig site. There's even a panel where the art style mimics the travel montage where Indiana's friends travel to different continents, and even a love interest that Peter is paired with, similar to all 4 indie films, and even the structure of the fetch quest that the original films had, with both Indy and Peter retrieving a mystical item that the Nazis wish to gain almighty power from, to which they temporarily do, but who are ultimately foiled by the end of the story. While there are noir tropes seen in the beginning, like when Peter investigates a murder scene on a nightclub, and Ferrero making the deliberate choice to emphasize shadows and rain in his artwork to add a more noirish atmosphere, the story and plot do not actually resemble anything remotely noir, and hence the justification for telling this kind of story, other than Peter required to shoot people at certain points with the character of Spider-Man Noir, becomes non-existent because the environment and plot do not simply match his character for his original purpose. Furthermore, there is the question of whether Margaret Stohl actually implements the inner tropes into the story in a meaningful way. For the purposes of this essay, I'm going to focus on when Dr. Humor turns on Peter Parker and puts a gun to his head and threatens to shoot him if his colleagues do not release the artifact, hence revealing herself as a Nazi. The situation is most likely based upon when Elsa Snyder betrays Indy and also reveals herself as a Nazi in the 3rd Indy film. However, in the original film, the twist of Elsa being a Nazi fundamentally changes the romantic dynamic between herself and Indy throughout the film, introducing a new conflict. Not only does this give Elsa some depth by having her openly object to some of the Nazis' more fanatical views later on in the story, and making her look like less of a stereotypical bad guy, but also provides great conflict for Indy, who is constantly trying to convince her to turn back to the good side and abandon the search for the mystical item. In this story, however, there is no setup for Humor and Peter's romantic tension. They do not personally interact with each other after her dramatic reveal, and also lacks the 3rd dimension that Elsa had in the original film. But most egregiously, she only acts as a villain for Peter to punch during the climax. Stohl is incrementing the Indiana plot points into the story, but does not understand why those plot points in the original film worked as effectively as they did, nor does he implement those tropes in such a way that it fits the world or tone of the Spider-Man Noir universe. It's simply referencing for the sake of referencing, or more aptly put, a Depthless homage that only seems to distract from the story at hand. Not to mention, this trope of the female revealing herself to be evil has not only been done well in other, more successful noir comics like Frank Miller's A Dame to Kill For, but it can be especially adapted to fit the character of Spider-Man Noir. Since Peter is established in this version as being a detective, perhaps Peter could use his skills to deduce that Dr. Humor is a Nazi and to just take action against her while he has the chance. Yet again, this can further differentiate this version from the main one even more, and establish him as his own individual character, as well as separate itself from other stories such as the 30 Indiana Jones films and A Dame to Kill For, as previously discussed. To conclude, Spider-Man Noir, Twilight and Babylon is a fast-paced but ironically uninspired adventure comic that unashamedly bases most of its plot off the original Indiana Jones films. The problem isn't necessarily that it takes inspiration from those films, but the fact that it does so that it detracts from the core concept of Spider-Man Noir in the first place. It has decent art by Juan E. Ferreira, and some memorable and aesthetically pleasing interpretations of some classic Spider-Man villains, such as Electro being a Nazi henchman who later transforms into a cool monster, and a chameleon being an actual chameleon and human hybrid. The story starts off with a traditional noir art style and a few noticeable tropes, but then progresses to a globe-trotting adventure that is recognizably an odd direction to take this character in. It's another fun action-adventure comic. It's not a modern masterpiece like Harleen, or an artistic travesty like All-Star Batman and Robin. It fails to live up to the original potential of Spider-Man Noir in the first place, and is not a fitting representation of the character. Alternate universe characters are simply different interpretations of characters in comics can and have achieved excellent potential. Gotham by Gaslight reimagines Batman in the Victorian setting, where this version of Bruce Wayne has to hunt down a serial killer. This alternate version of the Batman story resonated with fans so well that it was not only subject to critical and financial success, but was also adapted into a short film in 2018, and at one point was going to be adapted into a video game. Not to mention Superman Red Son, a story that sets Superman as a political figure during the Cold War, was subject to even greater critical reviews and financial success, and also received a film adaptation in 2020. These stories worked and were so successful because they understood what made the original characters operate, and chose to craft a story and setting where the way they operated was sifted and warped and challenged in such a careful manner as not to be unfaithful to the original source material, but to formulate a good and compelling story that pays reverence to the character. These alternate stories can work, and it can especially work for a character like Spider-Man. However, modern audiences are yet to receive such a take on the noir and web crawler that embraces its setting and actually focuses on how the character would change in accordance to his environment. Perhaps one day in the future, we'll have a professional writer who realizes the potential of Spider-Man Noir and crafts a story that is on par with novels like Gotham by Gaslight and Superman Red Son.